Welcome to Pluralsight's mini podcast series highlighting individuals that have broken into the tech industry via non-traditional methods and backgrounds. I'm Josh Ruggles, and with me today is April Speight, a Spatial Computing Cloud Advocate at Microsoft. How are you doing today, April?
I'm doing all right, and yourself?
I'm doing great. Thanks for joining me today.
No problem.
So to start off, why don't you just tell me a little bit about yourself, how you got into technology, and let's go from there.
All right, yeah, cool. So I started out my professional career in the luxury fashion industry. I was a menswear stylist, and I was also a visual merchandiser. As I was nearing graduation in undergrad, I realized I needed something that was going to more so align with the lifestyle that I wanted. And so the years that I worked in fashion in undergrad, and even though I had a small stint after I graduated too, I realized that it wasn't quite where I wanted to be in terms of where I saw my career going and growing, I would say. And so I went and took a look internally at some of the skills I had from that I got since undergrad. And I spent some time doing project management, and I figured, all right, well, this could be cool. Let me see what roles are open in project management. And I kept coming across a lot of positions in tech. So I said, all right, at no point did anyone mention tech when I was learning about this. So I said, okay, well, we'll see. And I started putting my resume out there, and fortunately, I actually had one place that actually had a chance to interview, and it was the Consumer Technology Association. And so for those of you who may not be familiar, they are the ones that host the international CES that happens every year in Vegas. So I ended up interning there, and I was an IT project management intern, ironically. And it wasn't that I didn't understand tech, it's just that on paper, there was no evidence that I had that experience. So once I got into that role, I started learning as much as I could. My position had a lot to do with software implementations, and I was also tier one support for our help desk. And I did a lot of the setup for the different tools that we were using. So a lot of interfacing with people internally who actually weren't technically savvy. And so I was that bridge between the developers who were very technical and the internal stakeholders who, for the most part, weren't. And I got to speak more or less two languages because of that. And so from there, I realized that, hey, I like helping people with their needs for whatever sort of software we're rolling out or tools. And I continued as a project manager from there. And then I started getting more into coding just out of fun. I just wanted to learn. And I started learning Python because I thought maybe I would go into data science. Didn't like data science. And so I said, all right, I have all this Python knowledge now. What am I going to do next? And that's when I discovered AI assistants and chatbots. So I started working more with that. I started creating content around it because that's the best way for me to retain information is to create content. And that ended up turning into editor acquisitions at Wiley, finding me and reaching out, asking that I want to author a book. I was surprised and I agreed to it. And so that led to my first book, which is Bite-Sized Python, an Introduction to Python Programming. And then my second book that just came out, Visual Studio Code for Python Programmers. But mind you, all this time, I'm still doing project management. And then when I started the first book, I was now a program manager at Microsoft, still not a developer by title. And then I would say maybe last January is when I officially made the transition over to doing being a developer. And so today I'm a cloud advocate at Microsoft on the spatial computing team. And I do a lot with mixed reality and augmented reality and virtual reality. So it's been quite the transition, I will say. And it's been a long journey and it's still going.
That's awesome. I mean, from luxury fashion to, Microsoft as a developer advocate, that's a big jump. Yeah, I totally cannot relate to that jump because it's just like such a so far, and it's awesome because it's just like, I mean, the whole point of this little mini series we're doing is, talking to people with these unconventional backgrounds that get into technology and really make it happen. And so I love that story. what got you into spatial computing and virtual reality and all that? Like, what was the draw there?
Yeah, so I knew it all existed. I didn't know spatial computing by its actual term, but I knew in general the technology in itself existed. And it wasn't until I saw a demo at one of our Microsoft events, can't remember which one, but there was real-time speech translation between an English speaker and a Japanese speaker. And they were doing it through a HoloLens too. And so I was like, oh my goodness, that's cool, because the one person who was speaking Japanese, you can see like a streaming video of them. And as they spoke, it got translated and displayed like text overlay in your actual environment in whatever into English. So I thought that was cool. I immediately went to Twitter because at the time I was just super active on Twitter, and I had asked out into the Twitter world, what technology do I need to know in order to do work like this? And so what amazed me probably most is that at one point in undergrad, I studied linguistics. So language is, I would say, probably one of like my first loves if we're thinking like academically. And so back to me reaching out on Twitter, I was able to get in contact with some folks from Magic Leap and then also some folks at Microsoft and the mixed reality team. And from there, they both got me up and running with learning about spatial computing, since both sides had the spatial element to it. And from there, I want to say that day that I saw the demo, mind you, I was at the airport when I saw it. I was on my way back home, got home. I spent the next 3 days learning C Sharp. I had no C Sharp experience. And on that fourth day, I went to an all-day workshop with Magic Leap to learn how to use the devices. So like I was committed. And from there, before I came to my team, I only had like 6 months of experience of learning. But once I got into my team, every day has been like a nonstop learning experience. And I can honestly say I've come a long way since I first started. But it was all because of that demo that I saw, and that it included that language component, which I was very passionate about. And now I feel like I've recreated like multiple iterations of that. So it's just interesting to see how it has come full circle. And it's probably one of my most favorite features to implement in any sort of app or experience that I'm creating.
That's really cool. You just got to dive in both feet first, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
you have to.
yeah, I mean, that's cool that, I mean, once you got a taste for it, you jumped right in and never looked back.
Yeah.
Back to the topic of the non-traditional technologist. In your view, what is a non-traditional technologist?
I feel that it's someone who isn't on the typical path to becoming something. So, really good example as it relates to tech, at least. Traditionally, people who get into this particular industry, they usually have some sort of computer science background, just traditionally. And so that's what they go to college for example. And they spend a lot of times focusing on programming and such. And then upon graduation, they land in roles where they code full time. That's what they do. They may have also done any sort of like whiteboarding, for example, for their interviews. They have a lot of projects they might have put together as examples. I feel like they eat, live, and breathe code. Well, I'm complete opposite of all that. I went to college for international business as well for my bachelor's, and then for grad school, I went for luxury and fashion management. And then I learned how to code really on my own from just finding various different resources online. And then when it came time to do the job that I'm doing now, I was very fortunate to have some managers on my side to make that transition possible. And I didn't have to necessarily follow that normal path. But it wasn't just because like it was just me. It was more so I had been creating content for so long, and my role that I'm in now is mostly creating content. So I had the examples already, and they were fully aware of that. So in terms of at least like my experience, that's more of a non-traditional technologist, because if you were to compare me to someone who may have done the CS route, our stories would probably be vastly different in how we got to where we are. But I'm very happy to see that nowadays that degree requirement is more or less almost no more. Like, yes, there are places who still require it, but being able to have that opportunity to get into a field that might not be like your background, but you spent some time learning, I think that's amazing. And I hope to see more companies take that path as well.
It's like, I mean, the way that you're talking about it, it's almost like there isn't really a formula per se,
Mm-hmm.
because that's kind of the whole point of the non-traditional role is like you get there in an unusual way, I guess,
Yeah.
and there is no cookie cutter pathway to that.
Yep.
But having said that, how did you carve out your own space? And we've talked about, like, we've brushed over some of this, but also if you were talking to another person that is looking in from the outside, how would you have them carve out their space, or what would you advise them to do?
For most people who, well, actually, really everyone who talks to me about, well, how can I do that? I always suggest starting out with understanding what your end goal is. So, not necessarily taking a chance to get to know everything that's under the sun. I like to say, what is it that you actually want to do? I don't need to know what the title is, but tell me as a day to day, when you wake up and go to that computer, what is it that you want to actually do as a role? And so, starting that conversation off, let's say, you know, in your deepest of hearts, you just want to design websites. So if that's what you want to do, then I suggest from there, okay, these are the different things that you will need to become familiar with. These are some of the languages that you may need to know, and that will help you understand what exactly is you want to do. Now, let's say in my area, because my area is like very, it's a very big spectrum of what you can do. Let's say I'm into audio. I just want to handle all the audio pieces of any sort of VR, AR app that people create. Well, then you can look into spatial audio because that's a whole thing in itself. And then you start learning the concepts around that. And so if you start to get an idea of what it is that you like working out without necessarily knowing what the appropriate term is of that role, that can help get an idea of where you should start with your learning. Now, of course, not everyone knows what their end goal is, and that's completely fair. When that happens, that's when doing some research will come into play, either talking to people who may be in tech. And I know some folks are introverted, so that's not necessarily the best way to go about doing it. So if that's the case, my next thing I would say to do is start looking at job postings on websites, not to apply necessarily, but to read the description of what roles entail. And if some tend to catch your eye more than the other, that's probably something that you might be interested in. And then from there, take a look at what the common requirements are and use that to help build your own sort of curriculum of what you should learn. But one thing I like to also tell people as well is just because you start on one path doesn't mean you have to stay on that path if you realize that you no longer want to do it. And that's something that I've spoken to multiple people about who, especially if they're coming into tech, I've run into someone who was in the midst of pursuing their doctorate in a completely different field. And then they said, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to come into tech, but then I'm worried about XYZ because this is a big change. And maybe it's just me, but the way I see it, I'd rather be happy in what I'm doing as opposed to resenting time committed and dedicated towards doing something else. And so that individual, they decided to make the transition, which they were very happy with. But just understand, like in my case, I started with data science and I hated it. And then I pivoted and now like I'm still not doing chatbots anymore. I had my own little stint doing that and it was great, but now I'm doing spatial and it's okay to change. But yeah, get an idea of what it is that you want to do. And that's what I've done with each life I've lived since working in tech, if you will. And then use that to help build up whatever it is that you should be learning and just know it's okay to change your mind.
That totally makes sense. If someone's like changing their mind, like how do you get mentorship when there's no clear
Mm-hmm.
cut role? Like what did you do when you needed guidance to
Yeah.
say like, what should I do? How do I excel? Like where do I go?
Yeah. So for me, I was fortunate to have friends who already worked in the tech industry. And so, from speaking with them more about what it was that they did on a day to day basis, really helped a lot. I was slightly at an advantage because when I was an undergrad, I was part of the National Society of Black Engineers. I wasn't doing programming or anything, but I just wanted to join. And so from there, I got to know more people who pursued that path. And so touching base with them more to help me figure out what I wanted to do made a big difference. Going about browsing around on the internet at what different roles entailed was also very useful. I don't know where the idea came from, but at some point, people just created infographics of different roles in tech. And so I would be on Pinterest just looking at all of them because it had a very condensed format of what a certain job entailed. It had pay estimates, which I'm going to be very transparent. That's very important. And then it also had an idea like what languages you might need, skills, what your day-to-day could be like. And so that helped me a lot too, something such as like Pinterest, for example. So between that, Pinterest, and then as I was making my way through tech as a PM, but still trying to figure out if I wanted to become a programmer, I was working alongside engineers, and I was very fortunate to have some who were willing to teach me, who were also willing to help me understand as well what it was that I need to know. And I know at one point at one job when I was a project manager, one of the managers over in the IT team, he and I would chat every so often about what career could look like, not necessarily with his team, but just in general in life. And that was very helpful as well. Having someone who can be very honest with you and be very honestly blunt about how things are really made a big difference. So you can find that mentorship from a variety of places. For me, it came from friends, managers, coworkers, and like I said, Pinterest. So, so you can really find it anywhere.
Yeah, love it. What are some of the pros and cons with this? Because I'm sure there's like really awesome pros. You get to do stuff that no one else is really doing.
Yeah.
But it's also sort of an amorphous job that, and trajectory that you have. I'm
Yeah.
just curious what your thoughts are on just the pros and cons that you've experienced.
Yeah. So a pro coming from fashion to tech is that when I was in fashion, it was very customer service oriented. And coming into project management, it's also customer service oriented as well because you're figuring out what people need. You are more or less doing all you can to give them what they need as well. And it was the same thing when I was a stylist. So that became a transferable skill. Having those customer service skills, even up to today, that still plays a big role in what I do because I spend a lot of time in a developer community raising awareness to different tools, but also getting feedback from folks and learning more about what it is that they want. And then also when people have issues they're running into, identifying those problems and finding solutions. So that pro there is that those skills were transferable. In addition to that, the creative side of everything that I was doing in college, when I was getting my master's, I went to Savannah College Art and Design. So they say they're a creative school for the arts, and that's what they are. And so a lot of what we did was coming from a creative artistic side. I spent time learning how to use Adobe Creative Suite. I spent time learning about branding as well. And I still apply that to my job today. Given that I do work in advocacy and I really pretty much create content, I can do all the editing, I can create all the visuals, and so on and so forth. Me doing my own personal branding has led me to where I am right now with my involvement in the developer community. So that was another thing I could transfer over. And it wasn't like, oh man, I learned all these skills and now I don't need them. No, I still need them a lot. So I'm still using them. Even with when I did international business for undergrad, even though I create content pretty much, and even though I had my PM role, it's all business oriented at the end of the day. And there has to be strategy behind it. There has to be marketing behind everything that we do. We have to align what the business goals are. Because I had that experience and that knowledge, to me, I understood. It didn't become this kind of friction for me when I started working in corporate and tech. So those were the pros, I would say. Of course, there's probably many more. As for the cons, however, I didn't personally experience this, but I want to put it out there because it's something important that I think people should be aware of. For some folks who I've spoken with who've come from a different industry into tech, and let's say they made it high up in their other industry, they had a beautiful title, they had XYZ salary, and for whatever reason they decide to leave and come to tech. And then it's a very humbling experience because it's like, that's great. You had all this experience in this other industry, but now you're in a whole new industry. You're more or less potentially starting from the bottom up. And that can discourage people because they'll think, I was like senior manager over in this one role, but now I'm coming in as a junior. This doesn't make sense. The reality is it does make sense. You're in a whole new place. And so unfortunately, you might end up with that title downgrade. And that's if you care about titles. I can go on forever about titles. Or you'll also run into like a salary downgrade as well. So it's something to consider. Not necessarily that like that will definitely be the case, but I would say that's more the majority for folks that I've come into. For me, it was opposite, given that fashion doesn't pay well. so coming into tech, I mean, it was like night and day. Granted, I started out many years ago. My very first salary was $47,000, and you couldn't tell me I wasn't rich. So it was a big difference. But that's just one thing to keep in mind. Another con is keeping up with all the lingo. There are just so many technical terms and jargon that tends to pop up, and it can be discouraging if you don't know what certain things are. Even now today, if I'm scrolling through Twitter and people are talking about some of the technical stuff they're doing, some of it I'll understand, and some of it I'm just like, I don't know what the heck this person is talking about. None of this makes sense. And it's like everyone's chiming in and having a good time talking about it. And I'm just like the person on the outside that can't relate because I don't know what it is. So sometimes you do feel a little bit isolated. And that's where you also start to develop imposter syndrome and feeling like, okay, I'm here, but I actually don't know as much as, everyone thinks I may know. And then you start feeling kind of down about yourself. But you also have to realize that no one woke up and became an expert in a certain technology or a certain language. We all had to start somewhere, regardless of if you do have a degree. I mean, you had to start somewhere. And so keeping that in the back of my mind helps a lot with making sure I don't start falling into that pit of despair of playing woe is me and I don't know anything. But that's another con, I would say, as well. Yeah.
I totally understand that feeling of just, trying to understand your terminology and all that stuff, especially with like it ballooning so quick. Technologies are being born like every day, it feels like. So,
yep.
So what are some of the biggest challenges you faced with your trajectory so far, and how did they shape your career?
So I was a job hopper, and when I was in the midst of looking for a new job at one point, one of the recruiters that I met with had told me that basically I didn't have tenure anywhere, so it would be hard for me to find a job. So that really made me feel really bad about myself, and eventually ended up getting a job. So like every time I do great stuff in my career now, I think back to that guy and I'm just like, I proved you wrong. I did definitely get a good job. One day I did. So that can be very discouraging if you tend to job hop. People have reasons for why they job hop. For me, it came from a matter of being satisfied and happy with what I'm doing. I don't believe in staying somewhere that no longer serves you and that you don't want to be, or if it's like a toxic environment. I fully believe that you should move on. And the reality is, some people are dealt bad hands like that, where it just so happens that every role they pursue, it ends up being a toxic environment. That's just reality. But for me, coming to that realization and looking at my resume that could have easily been 2 pages long, when I decided to look for a new role before coming to my current job, I did my due diligence and spoke with as many people as I could at different companies that I was interested in, so I could get a feel for what it was like working there. That, I would say, is probably one of the best things I've learned over time as it relates to finding a good place to be. So in that case, like just having so many things in my resume was definitely a challenge, because people won't necessarily take you as serious as you feel you are. And I get it, just given that when people are hired, you are under the impression they're going to be there. They're going to be able to be there for as long as, they'll say that they're committed to help out with like a project or something. But if all of a sudden 2 months in, they quit, from a manager's perspective, now you got to rehire for that. And it's not like the hiring process takes 2 weeks. You actually got to find candidates. So I get it. But me choosing my own happiness first definitely, unfortunately, became a challenge. So there's that. In addition to that, the other challenge I would say that I had was sometimes I had to play catch up. So I would be placed into positions where I had a certain task that I needed to do. And instead of being able to do it at the speed that would have been preferred, I actually had to like sit there and learn from like point zero so that way I can understand what was happening. And that really like sucked, I'll be honest with you. But taking the time to learn is good, rather than just pretending you know everything. And that made a big difference. Even like a good example, when I started in Microsoft, I was doing stuff with reference docs. And up to that point, I didn't really use any reference docs because I was not a programmer by profession. I just did it for fun. And so I really had to understand how these docs are formatted and how people are using them. And it was a very humbling experience as well. But I would say those have been the challenges, not necessarily understanding certain things I'm responsible for doing. And then also the fact that I loved job hopping. So I'm happy now where I am. So hopefully I don't hop anymore.
I love that you own that you love job hopping or have in the
Yes.
past, because I think a lot of people have been there, whether
Mm-hmm.
it's a couple months or a year. You brought up that you had this list of places that you wanted to work or that you had an interest in working. How big is that list? And I mean, it just seems like a really deliberate move, and I really like that. For anybody in any industry, it's a good idea to just
Mm-hmm.
understand before you're in the hiring process where everyone's trying to swoon you as much as you're trying to swoon them. And
Yeah.
just I really like that aspect that you brought up. How did you go about doing that?
Everything I feel like tech related for the most part happens on Twitter. So as for me, as I started to become more active on there, I started getting an idea of where just people worked in general, and also getting an idea of what they actually did for their job. I knew I wanted to work in developer relations and be a developer advocate. And so I started getting a feel for what companies in tech had advocate roles, and connecting with people who were actually in such a position made a huge difference. I want to say I had maybe 5 different companies on my list of where I wanted to look into to do advocacy. And in some cases, I didn't even speak to who would be people who would be my future coworkers. I actually spoke with managers as well. Even for one company, I spoke with a CEO, and it was a startup. So that made a big difference. I was able to get an understanding, firsthand of what things were like. And you'd be surprised, sometimes, regardless of the level that someone is, people will be very honest about how things are at a company. And I can appreciate that. And I do the same thing when people reach out to me when they happen to see places I've worked and they want to know, like, what was it like working there? I think that's important because it paints a realistic picture. The worst thing you can do for someone is sell a dream that's not realistic. And so, as I was looking into different roles, I was connecting with people through like direct messages. People were open to scheduling Zoom conversations, for example, so that way I could learn more. And it wasn't necessarily from a, hey, can you refer me? It was more so I want to know what's going on here. I want to get a feel for how you feel about it, where things are going. It's almost like you're interviewing them before you even apply. And I think that's important because, as most of us know, applications take time. So I'd rather have a conversation with someone about a company before I now go waste my time applying, only to realize that I wouldn't like the environment. So I did that for a couple of months, actually. I was employed already, so I wasn't in a rush to go get a job somewhere else. And so I took that time to do that. And I know for some folks who have the opportunity to leave a role and then spend some time thinking what it is that they want to do, for those folks who have that opportunity, whenever I speak with them, I'm like, if you are not in a rush to get a new job, spend that time understanding what it is you want to do, what do you want in a company, and learn more about that company. And then for those of us who, we need a job right now and we can't just go stop working for 3 months. Learn as much as you can while you're in that role. Do still take your time. I know for some positions, you're just ready to go, but you don't want to make a haphazard decision just purely because you want to leave that other place. Take your time to make sure you're making the right move before you regret whatever that right move is.
Yeah, I like that. Just the deliberate actions. If you're going to be job hopping, at least do it right. I
Yeah.
really like that. Well, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up your book that you mentioned earlier. How did that come about? I mean, you brought it up a little bit, but tell us what people can learn from it too.
It came up also in a very non-traditional way. And it's kind of hard when people who also want to become published authors with a publishing company, and they'll ask me, well, what's the process like? Because I didn't apply to write a book. I had content that existed on the internet, and it so happened that someone who worked for a publishing company saw it. And so I always love doing written tutorials, but the book writing process is way more intense than that, at least for technical books, I would say. And when you're writing technical books, I feel like a lot of what I do is a humbling experience, but writing technical books is a super humbling experience. You don't realize how much you don't know until you start writing on a topic. And for me, that first one, for my first book, is Python. And so I thought I knew Python, but then when I actually sat down to really explain everything about Python, it's just like, you know what? I don't know why we use return statements. So then you end up going down the rabbit hole of trying to understand and figure that out. And fortunately for me, I had the opportunity to choose my technical editor. And so it was someone I trusted, someone I knew that would be honest, someone who had been writing Python books for as long as I've been alive. And so he was there to help me out with everything. But when it comes to writing books, a very important thing to know, and actually my manager has shared this with me because he's also written books, is that a lot of the feedback that you get from the editors, some of it might be negative, and there might be a whole bunch of comments, and they're just like, no, this doesn't make sense, this is wrong, blah, 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 blah. It can definitely hurt you, like your ego. But my manager reminded me that's because all their feedback is because they want to see the book succeed. They don't do it to be mean, but they just want this to be something that turns out well for everybody. So keeping that in the back of my head was really important. I ended up doing my second book, and now I'm on a big book writing break. So I need to have my life back, if you will. But for anyone who is interested in learning Python from ground up, at least all the basics, the Bite-Sized Python Introduction to Python Programming book is going to be ideal. Even though the audience is going to be more of that preteen age, it isn't necessarily written for preteens in the sense that only preteens would appreciate it. I've written it in the sense that if you're going through the book with a child, for example, and if you're the adult, as an adult, it's not like trying to help your child out with advanced algebra or calculus 3, for example. It's written in a way so that way you too can understand and help out. And because of that, believe it or not, a lot of folks who have purchased that book are also people who are from early 20s all the way to probably my mom's age, for example, because they want to learn. And so regardless of where you are in terms, if you really want to look at age and think this is a kid's book, it's not for me. No, it's for you, especially if you're just starting out. The second book, however, you do need to have some Python experience. I don't focus as much on the how to code. I'm more so focused on what tools you can use in Visual Studio Code to do Python project or Python related projects. So good example, I did an entire section on Docker, so containers in general. And I containerized, I think it was a website, for example. So it's not necessary that you understand Python, because I gave you all the code for the site that's going to be containerized. What is important though, is that you're able to go through what containers are. You might have some knowledge of what it is, and I might touch a bit upon exactly how they work, but it's opposite in the sense where with this book, you don't focus on the code, you focus more on the concepts, if you will, but you got to kind of understand certain things I'm talking about. So if I'm talking about containers, I'm assuming that you have some knowledge of containers, at least at introductory level. If I'm talking about Jupyter Notebooks, you should know something about Jupyter Notebooks because it's not a book on Jupyter Notebooks, for example. There's some Azure services that I go through, and for those, I explain a bit more how it works because I don't expect everyone to know how Azure is and how Azure works. But if you are looking for a code editor and you're either curious or you know for sure it's going to be Visual Studio Code, and if you want to understand how to best utilize it from a Python perspective, then Visual Studio Code for Python programmers is for you. So the audiences are definitely different. I personally feel if you start with the first book, the second book might be ideal. For the first book, I do everything in idle, so that way you don't have to go download a code editor or IDE to do any of the coding. So the second book is kind of like the next step up once you understand Python.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate all the info about the book because I think it'll help a lot of those people that may want to jump into their own non-traditional role. And, you know, even myself, like I was born a writer. And so I definitely know what you mean when you say writing makes you realize all the holes in your knowledge. And
yeah,
it's like, if you want to become an expert at something, write a book about it and you'll probably be there by the time you're done.
That's an accurate statement.
Yeah. Well, great. So do you mind if we do a couple rapid fire questions?
Yep, I'm ready.
Awesome. What was your first job ever, not tech related?
My dad's a cosmetologist, and so my first job ever was washing hair in his salons.
How do you keep your tech skills current?
I block out a big chunk of my time throughout the week just learning. Fortunately, a decent part of my role is learning different technologies. So I'll spend like 2 to 3 hours every day focusing on a topic. So right now that happens to be VR with the mixed reality toolkit. So that's what I've been working on all week so far.
If you could do a TED Talk on something other than technology, what would you pick?
I would probably do a TED Talk on Barbies. Just given that I am obsessed with Barbies. I grew up as a Barbie collector. Even here in my office behind me, I have like 5 or 6 Barbies plus some more in my closet. And so I can talk about Barbies and how you can go about modifying their faces, about like how they look. You can change their hair, not just combing their hair. I mean, you can take all the hair strands out and rethread them and everything. So there's like a whole world that I feel like only true Barbie people know about, but I could talk about it for like forever in the style of a TED Talk. And I would be happy to say thanks for coming to my TED Talk.
Yes. Have you ever wanted to quit tech and why, if so?
No, I like being here. Yeah, sometimes certain days aren't favorable, but I've never had that inkling to just like leave altogether. I love it here.
What's a secret talent of yours that you wish more people knew about?
It's not a secret in the sense that I don't tell people about it, but it's more so I just never talk about it, I would say. And it's the fact that as it relates to sports, like even though on the exterior, I look very girly, but I did archery. I competed in archery in middle school. And then in college, I played rugby as well. And so like I try to sneak that into conversations when people are talking about like sports they've played.
Yeah, just slide it in real quick.
Yeah, just real quick.
Yeah, love it. iOS versus Android?
iOS, hands down.
Laundry or dishes, which is worse?
Dishes, definitely dishes. Laundry, I feel like is you separate the clothes, you put them in the machine, you decide what should be dried, and then you wait like a month to fold everything. I'm okay with that. So
yeah, I'm pretty sure everybody goes on that same cycle. So
yeah,
piles for a month and then you're like, okay, I'll fold, I guess.
Yep.
What's something you believe in, but most people disagree with you?
I believe that we're in a simulation. So I know that sounds like what in the world, but there are too many things that are coincidence in this world for us to not be living in a simulation. I mean, and of course, you know, I know how cookies work and I know how algorithms are, but it's when you have thoughts that all of a sudden come to be in real life, like coincidentally. And so that's when I know we're in a simulation. And it's funny because there's not a day that goes by where you can't find me saying that out loud in real life in some situation. So that would be the one thing I would say.
I love that. Have you ever heard of Yuval Noah Harari?
No.
He wrote three books. One of them is called Sapiens, but he talks like all about like the human race, and you'd probably be really interested in it because he doesn't talk about like the theory of, that we're in a simulation,
Yeah.
but it's in that same vein. So it's very
Oh,
interesting. But
oh wow. I
I'll
gotta
have to
check
send
that
you a
out.
link later. Cool. And then last one, what are you reading, listening to, book, blog, podcast, etc.? Any of your choice.
Yeah. So there's two, and I'm trying to find the name. So the one book, because I have to look over to see what it's called. It's How to Learn Almost Anything in 48 Hours. I'm reading that because there's a lot that I need to learn right now, and I'm trying to like cram as much as I can into my head as possible without being too overwhelmed. So I'm trying to read techniques in there. And then for podcasts, I always tell people listen to LeVar Burton Reads. It's probably the best podcast ever. If you grew up with LeVar Burton on Reading Rainbow, or if you just like being told short stories, that podcast is the best podcast for that. And plus, like, it's LeVar Burton, so you can't beat that. So LeVar Burton Reads. I'm big into short stories, so I could like not recommend that podcast more enough. Like, go check that podcast out.
Awesome. I love it.
Yay.
Well, April, I really appreciate the time. It's been awesome to get to know you and understand more about your journey getting here. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.